Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum. Thank you. Welcome to the Harborne Islamic Study Circle HISC Seerah session 84. Last week we talked about the economy and economics in Islam and the process of setting up a commercial zone within Medina. Next week, inshallah, we'll be talking about the start of the other sort of plank of what the Prophet was doing in Medina, which was around internal security and external security. So developing an army, developing foreign policy. So those things next week. So what I thought we would do at this session was just focus on a few other minor things that have happened between the Hijra and the first sort of battles or expeditions. So we don't always have a timeline on these, but I thought I'd just put them all together here. So there's a bunch of a few stories intertwined in today's session. So the first thing to mention is that the first person to be born in Islam was Abdullah bin Zubair. Now, Asma bint Abu Bakr, she says that when she did the Hijra, when she emigrated, she came to Medina, she stayed in Quba, and then she gave birth to Abdullah bin Zubair there. And then she took him to the Prophet ﷺ, and then he placed Abdullah bin Zubair in his lap, called for a date, and then the Prophet ﷺ put the date in his mouth, he chewed it, took a piece of it out, and then put it on the tongue or in the mouth of the newborn baby. So the Prophet ﷺ then made a dua, prayed for Abdullah and blessed him. And so Asma very proudly says that Abdullah was the first baby born in Islam. And we talked before about how important the Hijra was for the Muslims. They saw this as being the start of Islam. The Hijra was that when Islam became established and the Prophet ﷺ was able to implement the kingdom of God, the law of Allah on earth. And so that's why afterwards, many years later, Umar chose the Hijra as the starting point for the Muslim calendar that we still stick to today. So Abdullah bin Zubair, and he turned out to be an incredibly blessed individual. And inshallah, if we have time in the future, we will talk about the lives of some special Sahabi, and he is certainly one of those. Related to that, so Asma's younger sister, Aisha bint Abu Bakr, she had been betrothed to the Prophet ﷺ. They had the nikah whilst they were in Makkah before the Hijra, and then after the Hijra, sort of some years later, Aisha then became the full wife of the Prophet. At this point in time, at the time of the Hijra, obviously Khadija bint Khuwaylid had passed away, and then some months after that, Prophet ﷺ married Sauda bint Zama, and then we have Aisha being his second wife. Then I think it's the third or the fourth year, Hafsa bint Umar became the wife of Prophet ﷺ, and then there were others that we know, like Zainab, Salama, Zainab bint Jash, Juwayriya, Habiba, Rihana, Safiya, Maimuna, and then there was Maria the Copt. So Aisha narrates a lot of these early hadith, and another hadith that she relates of the first few months is that everyone was feeling homesick. So they've all grown up, lived their entire lives in Makkah, very privileged city, and because that's where the Kaaba is, that's where people come in and they do the Hajj, they do the pilgrimage, and it's the center of commerce for Arabia. So they've lived in that environment, and now suddenly they feel exiled. They've had to give up everything, and doing Hijra, doing the migration, is essentially leaving everything. You are leaving your home, your wealth, your family relations, your tribe, your security, and starting somewhere new. We've talked about that on numerous occasions. But it was only natural for the people, once they got into this new alien environment, they're not used to it. Medina is a very different city, very different climate. They started to feel homesick, and many of them literally became ill, became sick. Excuse me. And so on one occasion, there's a story where Aisha, she goes to her father, Abu Bakr, and sees him, and he's in a severe fever, and whether he's delirious or not, she sort of tries to comfort him and talk to him, and then he says that when we wake up without our family, but death is closer to us than our shoelaces to our toes. So quite dramatic, melodramatic, you want to say, but basically feeling homesick. He's sick and tired of Medina. He's thinking of death. He is obviously in a very ill state. So that's Abu Bakr as-Siddiq. Okay, and then shortly after that, she goes and meets Bilal and asks Bilal, "How are you? How are you doing? How's life?" And then he goes off on a tangent and recites some poetry, something like, how I wish I would, spend a night in a valley full of thorns, as in, he's missing the climate and the environment of Makkah, very harsh, dry, barren, thorns. And he said, look, and Medina's quite lush, but it's different. So I'd love to be back and spend a night in a valley of thorns. So then, Aisha heard him say, "Oh, may Allah's punishment be on," and then he reels off all the people who've been oppressing him, and that he felt had forced him out of Makkah. So then she goes and she narrates this to the Prophet ﷺ, because she's much younger, so she has a very different attitude to the movement from Makkah to Medina. So the Prophet ﷺ, he recognizes the seriousness of this. If people like Bilal and Abu Bakr, even though they may be ill and sick and delirious, are talking like this, so then he makes a special dua, and it's narrated where he says, "Oh Allah, make Medina beloved to us as we used to love Makkah, and even more." And so, just as Ibrahim alayhi salam made dua to make Makkah sacred, the Prophet is now making a dua to say, can you make Medina beloved to us, just as we used to love Makkah, or even more than that. Okay? And then he also asked Allah to bless the people in their food measurements, the food supplies, and etc., and to remove the bad weather and the plagues in Medina, and then throw them out of the city to a particular place where there was a swamp. So, figuratively speaking, take the illness that is there within Medina, scoop it out and place it out of the city, and purify the people and purify their hearts. And then slowly but surely people started to love the city of Medina, and it became more beloved to them than Makkah. So much so, obviously, that after 7-8 years of being in Medina, after the conquest of Medina, to my knowledge, none of the Mohajir returned back to Makkah for home. Obviously not the Prophet ﷺ, but no one else, because this was now home. They'd embraced it. They loved it from inside their hearts, and it wasn't just the city that they loved. They loved the people as well, especially the Ansar. Okay, and the Prophet ﷺ said to people, and given this as part of the brotherhood thing that we talked about, that a sign of Iman, a sign of belief and faith, is to love the Ansar, and a sign of hypocrisy is to hate the Ansar. So, it was encouraging all the Muslims to love the Ansar from the bottom of their heart. Okay, and we know much later on the very famous Hadith of Prophet ﷺ, where he's consoling the Ansar after a testing period of time. And he says, if I could give up my lineage, and we know the Prophet is the best of the best. He's the grandson of Abdul Muttalib. His lineage is Hashim, okay, and goes back to Qusay. So he's got the best lineage, and he goes, if I could, I would give up my lineage and be with you. I would give up that, and I'd be recognised as one of the Ansar. And he goes on to say, were it not for the Hijra, I would have been one of you. And if you had all of mankind going in one direction and the Ansar went in another direction, I would go with the Ansar. And then Allah also praises the Ansar in the Qur'an. And obviously he praises the Mohajir first because they're at a station higher than the Ansar. So you'll find in the Qur'an where Allah's talking about praising the Prophet, praising the Mohajir, and then praising the Ansar. But he's grouping them together in that ranking. So there we have how within, due to the dua of the Prophet ﷺ, the intervention of Allah, and just the nature of the people, what's in their hearts, they started to love Medina. They started to love the people of Medina, and the bonds got stronger between them. Also, we find in these first couple of years, certainly before the Battle of Badr, that most of the rules and regulations, the Sharia regarding the personal ibadah, the worship, they were revealed, obviously except for Hajj, which I think came in the 9th year Hijra. Most of the other aspects of the personal ibadah were revealed in this period of the first year and a half, where the new society is being built, where they are being pulled together and forming a new bond. And then we see in Ramadan of the first Ramadan of the year of the Hijra, nothing happened then, and then the following Muharram, Prophet ﷺ made the 10th of Muharram wajib, made it compulsory, fard, because he got to know that the Jews were going to they felt it was special for them, but he wanted it special for him because Musa is closer to him. So the 10th of Muharram is compulsory. So that was the first time fasting had become compulsory. Prior to that, it was recommended. It was a nafil, but now it's become compulsory. And then later on, a few months later, the verses in Surah Baqarah came that the Ramadan, the following Ramadan, that fasting during the month of Ramadan also became compulsory. So that was in the second year. So that, I think, verse 185 Surah Baqarah, where Allah prescribes fasting such that we may become have God consciousness, have taqwa. And also during that Ramadan, the Prophet ﷺ, he made Zakatul Fitr, we would call it Eid al-Fitr as well, Zakatul Fitr to become compulsory. So it gets the people, the community, used to the idea of compulsory charity. So then they gave compulsory charity, and then shortly after that, within a few weeks or months, weeks probably, the revelation came to make zakat compulsory. So the 2.5% of the wealth, unused wealth, that was then made compulsory. So you have the sort of the softening up with the wajib of the 10th of Muharram and Zakat al-Fitr, and then Allah then reveals that the rules as we know them today. Also, we're not sure exactly when, but when they came to Medina, we talked about this before briefly, the prayers that as we have them now, were canonized. Prior to this and to the Hijra after the Isra wal Miraj, we know the 5 prayers were mandated, but the people used to pray 2 rak'ah 5 times a day, and it was only after they arrived in Medina that then the Prophet ﷺ, he then increased the prayers of Dhuhr, Asr, Maghrib and Isha beyond 2, so to 3 and 4. So all of that happened within this short space of time, again focusing on the spiritual development of the early Muslims, and it was a critical moment. And you can see, as we've talked before, there was a lot going around at the time. There's a lot to take in. It's a complete paradigm shift, a complete revolution in how people lived, thought, acted and behaved. And then you've got all these rules and regulations coming in, people embracing them as best as they can. And then partly because of this, you can see how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes the Muslims as Ummah Wasatan. And this revelation, and we talked about this a couple of weeks ago when we talked about the change of the Qibla. So in the middle of those verses in Surah Al-Baqarah, you've got Allah talking about the Muslim Ummah being Ummatan Wasatan. And sometimes it's translated as the middle nation, but a closer, more appropriate translation is the best nation, or the highest nation, the nation at the pinnacle, because that's the truer meaning of the word, wasat. So, and we find that Allah uses the word in other parts of the Qur'an, like in Surah An-Nur, where He's describing the best. So here Allah is cementing this idea that we are the best nation because we do all of these things, and as long as we stick to these things, we have a right to call ourselves the best. If we deviate, then obviously there's we've abdicated our role and responsibility. And then sort of just picking up on a couple of other things with regards to the Hijra, so just talking about the verses around the change of the Qibla. Also, Hijra was compulsory. It was a fard on the early Muslims, on every Muslim. And we all know the famous Hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, where he talks about those who do migration for the sake of Allah, Allah will reward them. Those that migrate for the sake of a woman, well, that's what they have. They can't claim just because they've physically done the journey from Makkah or wherever to Medina. They may do it for money, for wealth, for fame, for a woman, that's the reason that they're doing it for. But if their intention is purely for the sake of Allah, then Allah will reward them, and that's where they get the spiritual reward. And again, that's why Bukhari and Nawawi and many of the other people who compiled the Hadith, the Muhaddith, they give so much prominence to that Hadith that essentially every action is judged according to its intention. If you want fame, if you want power, then that's what you're going to get. But if you do things purely for the sake of Allah, Allah will be happy. So, and again, we've talked about that before when we talked about heaven and hell, and the people that will be, some of the people will be cast into hellfire. So giving study circles or doing charity or doing lots of publicity around something. If it's done for the wrong reason, it counts for nothing. If you do it purely for the sake of Allah, then it is accepted. Okay, so Hijra was compulsory on the early Muslims, and Allah says in Surah Al-Hajj, whoever immigrates for the sake of Allah and they are killed or they die, Allah will give them the best of all rewards, and Allah will enter them into the best of places. And then later on, later verses, in Surah An-Nisa, which came a couple of years later. And this was after one of the battles where some of the Muslims who were secret Muslims from Mecca, they died in what we would they were killed by the people of Medina, and it was, you could say, accidental, because they were forced to fight, but they didn't fight. They stayed back and they didn't actively participate in the fighting. So they were playing a support or ancillary role. Yet, with some stray arrows or whatever, some of them were killed. And so there was confusion, what's going to happen to those? And inshallah, we'll talk about that in more detail in the coming weeks. But Allah revealed this verse, where those people whom the angels take their souls whilst they are committing sins against themselves, the angels will say, why are you in this state? Right? So you died here. Why did you die here? And then they will say, because we were persecuted in the land. We were weak. We were persecuted. Okay? And the angels would say, could you not have gone to the land of Allah? Okay? The land of Islam. You're there in Makkah. You could have gone to Medina. So again, we can see just even sort of after the Battle of Badr how these things how Allah is, really encouraging everyone who can that they should make the migration from from Makkah to Medina. And the angels are taking the souls of these people and basically asking, why were you here? You were committing sins against yourself. You could have gone to Medina. And then Allah revealed in Surah Al-Ankabut, where He says, there are those that say we are believers, but when he is slightly irritated, he considers the fitna of the people to be as bad as the punishment of Allah. Okay? And with the help of when the help of Allah comes, they say we are the believers. So basically here you've got people who, as we said earlier, when you migrate, when you do hijrah, you leave your old world behind. You leave your wealth, your property, your kinship, everything gets left behind, and you're starting new. And oftentimes you're starting in abject poverty, which is why you need the help of the Ansar, and we'll talk about the Ahle-Suffa in a second, inshallah. But there are some people who claim to be Muslims, and despite Allah saying you need to do hijrah, they remain in Makkah. And then when the times are favourable, say, yeah, we're Muslims, but when there's a bit of pressure put on them, they recoil from that. Okay, so again, Allah is really saying that you have no excuses to be staying back in Makkah. I'll come on to that in a second. The other point is, here you've got a clear delineation. We now have a Darul Islam, a land where there is Islam. And then the bits outside that are the land where there is no Islam. And that's why, as I say, when we started today's session, when Asma bint Abu Bakr said that Abdullah bin Zubair was the first one to be born in Islam. So Hijrah was mandated, and it was only after the Battle of Ahzab that the rulings of Hijrah became slightly more lax. And then after the conquest of Makkah, Prophet then said that there is no Hijrah after the conquest of Makkah. So that's it, your time is up. Now that Islam has conquered Makkah and everywhere is going to become Muslim in the peninsula, there is no concept of Hijrah anymore. Those rules are now abrogated, and you've missed your chance to get the reward for Hijrah. But then just going back to that, there was one particular person that some people say that this particular verse was revealed that encouraging people to go to Medina specifically, and this is a story it's quite a touching story of Jundah ibn Damura. So he was a weak, elderly, and blind man, and he was not able, because of his condition, to do the hijrah, because he was weak, elderly, and blind, and he was, he wasn't that well off, and he didn't have a family who could take him there. Then when these verses of Surah Nisa came, essentially